The road into Maple Hollow twisted like an old ribbon, curling past bare trees and weathered barns. Emily Davis hadn't seen this part of Vermont since she was 17, and now, 13 years later, everything looked smaller, quieter, but somehow heavier. The town had aged like a person, with deep-set wrinkles in its sidewalks and tired, windswept look that mirrored her own fatigue. She kept her hands tightly on the steering wheel of the rental car, knuckles pale, her breath shallow. The funeral was an hour, and she didn't know what to expect, other than cold stares and colder memories. Her grandmother's house came into view just past the last bend. It was the same pale yellow, chipped at the corners and softened by vines that had been allowed to grow wild. The porch sagged slightly. Emily parked the car and sat for a moment, staring up at the second-story window that had once been hers during long childhood summers. It was closed now, the curtains drawn. She imagined the house watching her back, remembering her, judging her return after all these years. Inside, the air was stale with disuse and time. The faint scent of lavender still clung to the wallpapered halls. She climbed the creaking staircase and set her suitcase down in the guest room without turning on the light. Her fingers brushed against the wooden frame of the bed, and memory came back fast. Her grandmother reading to her late at night, voice hushed but firm, a hand resting gently on Emily's shoulder. Those were the moments that had felt real. The rest, her mother's shouting matches with Aunt Margaret, the cold meals and tense silence, the endless rules, those she had buried deep. The funeral was held at the small chapel near the town square. The pews were filled with familiar faces she hadn't seen in over a decade, whether neighbors, aging cousins, and a few old classmates who stole glances but said nothing. Her Aunt Margaret stood near the front with her two daughters, rigid and composed. When Emily entered, Margaret's eyes narrowed just slightly, but she said nothing. No embrace, no nod, just a pursed-lipped look of disapproval that said, "You shouldn't have come." The service was brief. The minister spoke of grace and family and the passing of time, but Emily barely heard it. Her eyes were fixed on the simple pine coffin, her mind swimming in unanswered questions. Why hadn't anyone told her sooner? Why had she learned of her grandmother's death through a neighbor's social media post? And more importantly, why had no one called since? After the burial, Emily approached her family, unsure of what to say. Her cousin Rachel turned her back almost immediately. Aunt Margaret remained rooted, her voice clipped. "There's nothing left to discuss," she said, brushing imaginary lint from her coat. "Everything has already been divided. We assumed you wouldn't be interested, given your distance." Emily's mouth went dry. "Divided? I didn't even know there was going to be a reading. No one told me anything." Margaret gave a smile without warmth. "There wasn't a formal reading. We knew what you wanted. It's been handled." Emily blinked. "But I wasn't." "You weren't invited for a reason," Margaret said, her tone final. She turned her back, signaling the end of the conversation. Emily stood in silence as the others drifted away, her boots sinking into the soft, cold earth. The wind tugged at the hem of her coat, carrying whispers from the trees. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the death of the woman who had once been the only warmth in this place, or the realization that her family had shut her out completely. Back at the house, she wandered through the rooms, noting the odd emptiness. There were no boxes of packed belongings, no signs of anyone having lived here recently. It was as if the house had paused in time, waiting for someone to return. She noticed the fireplace still had half-burned logs in it, and the calendar in the kitchen was still on the same month her grandmother had passed. No one had bothered to flip it. She made tea in silence, remembering the way her grandmother used to hum when boiling water. Now there was only the whistle of the kettle and the ticking of the old wall clock. Emily sat at the dining table with the teacup in both hands, unsure of what to do next. Part of her wanted to leave in the morning, go back to Boston, and forget any of this had happened. But something about Margaret's words had lodged itself deep in her mind. Everything has already been divided. It didn't sit right. Her grandmother had been sharp, careful with details. She would not have left things ambiguous. And even if she had chosen to leave nothing to Emily, the process would have been official, handled by a lawyer, not whispered behind closed doors. The silence from the family was too deliberate, too calculated. That night, She slept in her old room, listening to the creaks and moans of the house. It groaned like a ship at sea, shifting in the wind, remembering its passengers. As sleep took her, Emily felt something she hadn't felt since childhood, like the house itself was keeping secrets. And in the morning, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway. "Miss Davis?" The voice was crisp, professional. "This is Mr. Whitman. I'm the attorney managing your grandmother's estate. I've been trying to reach you. There must have been a mix-up. No one mentioned you were not at the will reading." Emily sat up, heart racing. "I wasn't invited. I didn't even know there was one." There was a pause on the line, then the quiet shock of realization. "That's highly unusual. You should have been the first to know. You are, after all, the sole beneficiary." Emily's breath caught. "What?" "Miss Davis," the lawyer said gently. "The entire estate was left to you. The house, the land, the assets, everything. Your name is the only one in the will." Emily stared out the window at the gray sky. In the distance, a crow cawed once and flew away. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of something irreversible. Emily sat in stunned silence for several minutes after the call ended, the lawyer's final words echoing in her ears like distant thunder. The only name in the will, sole beneficiary. It was too surreal, and yet it made a sharp kind of sense. Her grandmother had always been kind to her, even protective, though she'd rarely spoken aloud of family matters. Still, this wasn't something Emily had ever expected. Certainly not after years of separation. She stood and crossed the room slowly, looking at the framed photograph of her and her grandmother on the mantel. A quiet warmth flickered in her chest, quickly followed by a growing unease. If the entire estate had been left to her, what had Margaret meant when she said everything had already been settled? Who had they divided it among? And how had they managed to exclude her so completely? Emily dressed quickly and drove to the law office, located in a small red brick building near the center town. Mr. Whitman was waiting for her in a paneled room with thick bookshelves and dust-frosted windows. He was a tall man in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed beard and spectacles that seemed to balance precariously on the bridge of his nose. He greeted her with a firm handshake and visible concern. "You truly had no idea?" he asked, offering her a seat. Emily shook her head. "Not a clue. Margaret told me it had all been decided already. She made it sound like I wasn't even considered." Mr. Whitman looked genuinely troubled. "That's deeply concerning. Your grandmother's was updated just 6 months ago. She was lucid, meticulous about the details. There's no ambiguity. Everything was left in your name, and only yours." He opened a file folder and passed it to her. Emily's name was typed at the top of the document, followed by a long list of property and accounts. It was all laid out in black and white. Her signature would be required for the official transfer, but there was no question about intent. "I'd like to meet with the family again," he said. "We'll read the will formally, with everyone present. If they've taken steps to divide the estate without legal authority, that's not just unethical, it's criminal." Later that afternoon, Mr. Whitman made the necessary calls. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. In the meantime, Emily returned to the house with a knot forming in her stomach. She spent the evening reviewing some of the documents Mr. Whitman had given her, trying to absorb the scale of what had been entrusted to her. The land alone stretched beyond the hills to the edge of the lake, and the house itself, though weathered, was structurally sound and rich with history. Her grandmother had preserved it carefully. Night fell heavily. Emily was halfway through sorting papers in the study when she heard footsteps on the porch. She froze, heart thudding. A knock came, firm, impatient. She opened the door to find Aunt Margaret, arms crossed and expression stone cold. "We need to talk," Margaret said, stepping in without waiting for an invitation. Emily stood her ground. "Now you want to talk?" Margaret's eyes flashed. "Don't play the innocent. You always knew she favored you." "I had no idea about the will," Emily said, voice steady. "You told me everything was already divided." Margaret walked into the living room and sat heavily on the arm of an old wingback chair. "Because we sorted it among the family. That house should have gone to Rachel. The land to Stephen. Your grandmother had been acting strange for months. She wasn't thinking clearly. That's not what the lawyer thinks, Emily replied. He said she updated the will recently. She was of sound mind. Margaret's lip curled. That man has always been too soft on her. And on you. Emily stared at her, anger rising. You excluded me. You didn't even tell me she died until it was too late to say goodbye. And now you're telling me you divided everything like it was yours to give. Margaret stood. Don't twist this. You left. You turned your back on the family. I left because this family never treated me like one of their own, Emily snapped. You made that clear a long time ago. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret took a slow breath and stepped closer. If you go through with this, if you really think you can keep all of this for yourself, you're going to regret it. Emily met her gaze. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you, Margaret said, before turning and walking out the door without another word. Emily locked the door behind her and stood in the dim hallway, shaking. Her fingers tightened around the doorknob. She had come expecting a funeral, maybe a few quiet memories. Instead, she was now at the center of something twisted and dark, something her grandmother must have seen coming. The next morning, the Davis family gathered in Mr. Whitman's office. The atmosphere was icy. Margaret sat between her daughters, Rachel and Beth, while Cousin Stephen leaned against the far wall, arms folded. Derek was there too, quiet and tense, eyes flickering between family members like he didn't quite know where to stand. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat and opened the will. I'd like to begin by stating that this is the official, updated last will and testament of Alice Davis, dated and notarized 6 months prior to her passing. The contents are legally binding, and there is clear evidence of her mental competence at the time of signing. He glanced at Emily, then read the document aloud. To my beloved granddaughter, Emily Davis, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the house at Pine Hollow, the surrounding property, all remaining financial assets, and any personal effects contained within the residence. He finished and looked up. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Rachel scoffed. This has to be a mistake. Margaret stood abruptly. It's outdated. That's not the last will. I was there when she said Rachel would take the house. Mr. Whitman frowned. I assure you, this is the most recent version. I was present at its signing. Your mother was very clear in her intentions. Beth muttered something under her breath, and Stephen slammed his palm against the table. This is insane. She can't just cut everyone else out. Derek finally spoke. Why not, if it's her choice? The others turned to him, stunned. She must have had a reason, he continued more quietly. You all know how things were. She saw the way this family operated. Margaret's face darkened. Watch your mouth, Derek. Mr. Whitman raised his hand. That's enough. The law is clear. If anyone wishes to contest a will, they may do so legally, but be aware that false claims of incompetency or fraud can carry serious consequences. The meeting ended with no handshakes, no closure. Emily walked out of the office into the sharp autumn air, her chest tight. The look in her aunt's eyes had changed. It wasn't just anger now. It was something colder, more deliberate. She understood then that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cold from the street clung to Emily's jacket long after she stepped back inside her grandmother's house. The meeting had shaken something loose in her, an awareness that the tension surrounding the will wasn't just family drama. It was something deeper, dangerous. She made herself tea again, more out of habit than comfort, and sat at the kitchen table with her phone in hand, staring at Mr. Whitman's number. She had more questions, but she wasn't ready to hear the answers. Not yet. What she needed was time. Time to think. Time to breathe. And, more than anything, time alone. That night, the wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters and groaning through the trees. Emily couldn't sleep. She wandered the house barefoot, arms folded against her chest. Every room whispered fragments of the past. The squeak of the floorboards, the smell of old paper, the faint echo of her grandmother humming in the pantry. She walked to the hallway where the wallpaper had begun to peel, her fingers tracing the edges of faded flowers. Her grandmother had kept this place alive with care, and now the silence felt like a loss too vast a measure. The next morning, the ringing of her phone pulled her from a fitful sleep on the living room couch. She answered without checking the caller. "Miss Davis?" Mr. Whitman's voice was unusually tight. "I just received several voicemails from Margaret Davis this morning. She claims you've broken into the house and are squatting without permission." Emily sat up straight, stunned. "What?" "She knows I'm here. She was here 2 nights ago." "I know," he said. "I explained to her that the house legally belongs to you, but it seems your aunt is preparing to escalate things. I wanted to let you know she's spoken to someone in local law enforcement. If an officer shows up, don't panic. Just refer them to me." Emily stood and crossed the window, scanning the road outside. "Is this really happening?" "I'm afraid so. Margaret is not used to being denied. But don't worry, I'll handle the legal side. In the meantime, I suggest documenting anything unusual. Take notes, record conversations if needed." "Unusual?" Emily asked. "You mean like her barging into the house and threatening me?" "Yes," he said, "or worse." After they hung up, Emily retrieved an old notebook from the desk drawer and started writing. She recorded everything she could remember from the conversation with Margaret, the meeting at Mr. Whitman's office, and the threats that had been made, subtle or otherwise. Her hand trembled as she wrote. This wasn't just a dispute. It was a campaign, and she was alone at its center. That afternoon, she drove into town to pick up supplies. Paper, batteries, a flashlight, a disposable camera. She didn't know what she might need, but something about the weight of the house, the intensity of her aunt's anger, made her feel she couldn't afford to be unprepared. The cashier, an older man with a faded flannel shirt and kind eyes, watched her closely as he rang up the items. "You're Alice's granddaughter, aren't you?" he asked. Emily hesitated. "Yes." "She talked about you," he said. "Not often, but when she did, you could see the pride in her eyes." Emily nodded, unsure what to say. "She was a sharp woman," he continued. "Didn't trust easily. But when she made up her mind about something, that was it. Don't let them shake you." Emily blinked at the unexpected support. "Thank you." Back at the house, she carried the bags inside and began organizing the living room. She stacked the papers Mr. Whitman had given her into a file box and marked it clearly. She set up the disposable camera in a drawer by the front door. And then she started walking the house again, but this time with a purpose. She checked locks, tested the windows, and made notes of any signs of tampering. She found none, but when she reached the second-floor hallway, a strange draft caught her attention. The window at the end was slightly ajar. She knew she hadn't opened it. She stepped closer and saw faint scuff marks on the wooden floor beneath it. Someone had been there. She closed the window and locked it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A pause. Then a man's voice, quiet and hesitant. "Emily?" She frowned. "Yes." "It's Derek." She nearly hung up. The family hadn't exactly earned her trust. But Derek had been the only one not openly hostile during the reading. "I wasn't sure if I should call," he said. "But I think you should know my mom's not letting this go." "I figured," Emily said. "She's talking to a private lawyer now. I overheard her say something about contesting the will. But there's more. She's trying to get others to say your grandmother wasn't well, that she didn't know what she was doing." "She's lying," Emily said, her voice sharp. "You were there. You saw the documents." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm not saying I agree with her. I just wanted to warn you. They're going to come at you with everything they can." Emily closed her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" Another pause. "Because I think they're wrong. And because my grandmother, she helped me too, once. When I was in trouble. She didn't tell anyone. She just helped. I think she saw something in you. Something worth protecting." Emily's throat tightened. "Thank you for calling." After the call, she sat on the floor of the old guest bedroom, the one that used to be her sanctuary. The sun filtered to the curtains in pale gold strips. The room was still. She looked around, searching for something. Anything. that might help her understand why her grandmother had made such a bold choice, and why everyone else seemed determined to erase it. The rest of the evening passed quietly, too quietly, until just past midnight. Emily was awakened by a noise, a sharp metallic clatter from downstairs. She grabbed a flashlight and crept out of bed, barefoot and alert. Each creak of the floorboard sounded like a gunshot in the dark. When she reached the staircase, she paused and listened. Silence. Then, from the kitchen, a faint sound, the soft closing of a drawer. She flicked on the flashlight and descended slowly, the beam sweeping across walls and floor. The kitchen was empty, but the drawer beneath the sink was open. She stepped closer and found the contents slightly rearranged. The Olgan opener, the twist ties, the dried-out matches. None were where she had left them earlier. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Someone had been inside. She checked the door. Still locked. Windows, too. She scanned the floor and noticed faint, wet footprints on the tile. Bare feet. They led to the back door and vanished. Emily locked the door again and backed out of the kitchen slowly, flashlight still trembling in her hand. She made her way to the living room and sat down, staring at the front door, waiting for morning. The house, so full of memories, no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a stage, and someone else was already part of play. Morning light crept in slow and hesitant, filtering through the lace curtains with a deceptive sense of calm. Emily hadn't slept after the intrusion. She had sat in the living room all night, clutching the flashlight, ears tuned to every creak and whisper the old housemaid. Her thoughts spiraled between fear and anger. Someone had entered the house. Someone had watched her, moved her things, and left behind footprints that disappeared before they reached the door. The locks had not been broken. No windows shattered. It was as if the house itself had swallowed the intruder. When the sun was fully up, she finally moved. She took a quick shower, dressed in dark jeans and a sweater, and tried to steady her hands with coffee. At 9:30, Mr. Whitman arrived in his Navy sedan, parking just outside the wrought iron gate. He stepped out with his briefcase in hand and a visible tightness in his shoulders. "They're already waiting," he said grimly as Emily opened the door for him. "Did you tell them I wanted the reading done here?" "I told them it was your legal right," he said. "Expect resistance." They set up in the dining room, at the long wooden table, where Emily remembered her grandmother arranging wildflowers in vases. Now, the space was sterile. The vases gone. The table empty except for a stack of folders and a small recording device Mr. Whitman placed carefully in the center. Shortly after 10 o'clock, the family arrived. Margaret entered first, lips pursed and chin lifted, as if entering enemy territory. Rachel and Beth followed her closely, both dressed in stiff black coats, though the funeral was long past. Stephen trudged in behind them, his face unreadable, while Derek lingered near the doorway, eyes darting around the room. The tension hit like a wall, thick, oppressive, and immediate. Emily didn't stand to greet them. She remained seated beside Mr. Whitman, expression guarded. "This is unnecessary," Margaret said before even taking her seat. "We've already been through this." "No, you haven't," Mr. Whitman replied evenly. "You never received a formal reading of the will. What occurred previously was unofficial and without my presence. Today, we rectify that." "Don't patronize me, Whitman," she snapped. You knew she was slipping near the end. She forgot dates, names. "I saw her every month, Margaret," he interrupted. She was coherent, fully aware and deliberate in her instructions. Rachel leaned forward. "Then why didn't she tell any of us? Why keep it secret?" Emily finally spoke, maybe because she knew how you'd react. The silence that followed was razor sharp. Beth rolled her eyes. "Here we go, playing the victim." "I'm not playing anything," Emily said. "I didn't ask for any of this, but I'm not walking away either." Margaret folded her arms, her glare cold. She was manipulated. Mr. Whitman activated the recorder with a soft click. "Let's proceed. For the record, I'm reading aloud the official last will and testament of Alice Davis, dated 6 months prior to her passing." The words were nearly identical to those he'd read in his office. Emily's name appeared again and again. Sole beneficiary. heir to the house, land, and all assets. No other names were listed. No bequests to other family members. No shared division. Margaret stood abruptly. This is absurd. She never would have cut out her own children. She did, Emily said, voice low, and the fact that you're all so ready to deny her wishes is probably why. You think you know better than us? Rachel said, rising to her feet as well. You weren't here. You weren't the one driving her to doctor appointments, or... I wasn't invited to be, Emily replied. I was pushed out a long time ago. Derek cleared his throat. Maybe we should all calm down. But Margaret wasn't listening. She turned to Mr. Whitman. I want a formal investigation into the validity of this will. If she was suffering from mental decline, then this document should be void. I anticipated this, Whitman said, pulling a second folder from his briefcase. That's why I brought this. He handed it to her. Inside was a transcript and a video copy, recorded just 4 weeks before the will was signed. In it, Alice Davis sat upright in the parlor of her home, speaking clearly, calmly. She looked directly into the camera and read the contents of her will aloud, followed by a short personal statement. I have made this decision because I've seen the worst and best of my family. I leave everything to Emily Davis not because she asked for it, but because she never did. She carries something the rest have forgotten: honor, humility, and care. Let this be my last word on the matter. The silence that followed was different. Not stunned or angry, but stunned and trapped. There was no way around it now. No more room for denial. Rachel looked pale. Beth stared at the table. Even Stephen dropped his arms from across his chest. Derek sat down slowly, expression unreadable. Margaret said nothing for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, she pushed the folder back across the table. This doesn't change anything. It changes everything, Mr. Whitman replied calmly. If you pursue legal action now, it will be seen not only as unfounded, but potentially malicious. The court will not look favorably upon it. Margaret's lips tightened. She stood, reached for her purse, and looked around at her children. Come on, she said. We're leaving. Rachel and Beth hesitated, but followed. Stephen was last, grumbling under his breath. Derek didn't move. Emily watched them file out the door, one by one. Margaret paused before crossing the threshold and turned back to face her. This isn't over, she said. Emily met her eyes, but said nothing. The door closed. Silence returned. Mr. Whitman exhaled. I'll file the official statement tomorrow. You're protected legally, but that doesn't mean they'll stop pushing back. I know, Emily said, standing. Thank you for coming. As he packed up his things, Derek remained seated. I didn't know she recorded that, he said quietly. She must have known what would happen, Emily replied. She was preparing for war. Derek looked down at the table. I didn't lie to you, Emily, but I didn't tell you everything either. She looked at him carefully. What do you mean? I have something, he said. I found it after she died. I didn't know what to do with it at first. I wasn't sure if it mattered, but now I think you should have it. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small flash drive. Place it on the table. What's on it? Emily asked. He hesitated. You'll want to listen to it alone. But it's recordings. Things I caught on a voice memo app. Conversations in this house. Stuff they didn't know I heard. Emily didn't reach for it. Not yet. Why now? Because I'm tired, he said. And because maybe she was right about you. He stood and left without another word. Emily picked up the flash drive, staring at the tiny object that suddenly felt heavy in her palm. She didn't know what was on it, but she knew it would change everything again. The flash drive remained untouched on the dining room table for hours after Derek left. Emily circled it like one might circle a sleeping animal whose bite could change everything. She had already uncovered more than she expected, and she wasn't sure if she was prepared to hear her family's secrets laid bare through stolen audio. Eventually, as twilight bled across the sky, she slipped the drive into her pocket and went upstairs to the study. Her grandmother's old desk was where she used to sit during summer visits, drawing pictures and writing stories while the rest of the house bustled with tension. The laptop there now was ancient but functional. Emily powered it up, plugged in a flash drive, and opened the only folder contained, titled simply The End. Inside were 6 audio files, each named only by a date. The most recent was 3 weeks before her grandmother's death. She clicked the first. Voices filtered through, Margaret and Stephen, their tones low and sharp, like 2 people trying to argue without being heard. The topic was unmistakable, her grandmother's will. They spoke of the estate as if it were theirs already, of what would go to whom. Margaret called the old woman too far gone to know the difference. Stephen laughed and said, "Then maybe we should help her forget." Emily stopped the recording, her pulse pounding. She listened to the next one, and the next, each one more damning. Rachel mocking their grandmother's routines. Beth admitting she had already looked through her jewelry, just in case. Derek had captured it all. Their cruelty, their greed, their impatience. In one recording, Margaret actually said, "She thinks she's in control, but that house will be ours the second she's buried." By the last file, Emily's hands were trembling. She sat in stunned silence as her grandmother's faint voice echoed through the speaker, fragile but clear, asking someone to leave her room, insisting she didn't want anyone going through her drawers. A door slammed, and then nothing but footsteps and the click of phone being turned off. Emily leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. So much had been hidden behind polite family gatherings and hollow words, now laid bare in digital files. All made sense. The urgency, the secrecy, the recorded will. Her grandmother had known what they were capable of, and she prepared accordingly. Emily spent the night in the study, cataloging the files, backing them up onto another device, and typing out a transcript of each one. When the sun rose, she brewed strong coffee and stood by the upstairs window, looking out over the backyard. The leaves had turned fully now, golden red and fire orange. The kind of autumn her grandmother used to call final honesty, when nothing could hide beneath the green. She had just turned away from the window when her foot caught the corner of a small rug beneath the old armchair. It shifted, revealing a square panel cut into the floorboards. Her breath caught. Kneeling, she ran her hand over the edges. The wood was smooth, worn by time, but there, a tiny notch, just large enough to grip. She pulled gently. The panel came loose with a faint pop, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. She stared down into it, the air rising from below cool and dry. It wasn't a basement. The layout of the house made that impossible. This was something else. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped carefully down the steep wooden steps, her breath loud in the silence. The stairwell twisted once, then ended in a small landing with a closed door. It looked old, the hinges crusted with rust, but the doorknob turned easily. The room beyond was no more than 12 feet across, with stone walls and a low ceiling. Dust hung thick in the air, but the space was organized. Shelves lined the walls, filled with labeled boxes, old photo albums, and notebooks. In the center was a wooden table with a lamp and, to Emily's surprise, a single open book. She stepped closer. The lamp flickered to life when she touched the switch, casting a soft glow across the table. The book was a journal. Her grandmother's handwriting filled every page in neat cursive, dated and indexed. Emily turned the pages slowly, absorbing names, events, and cross-references. This wasn't just a diary. It was a log, a record of everything that had happened in the family over the last 20 years. She found entries about Margaret's financial troubles, about Rachel's arguments with her husband, about Beth's failed business ventures. Her grandmother had written not with spite, but with clarity, recording facts, reactions, behaviors. The entries weren't emotional. They were observant, precise. Near the middle of the book, a phrase began to repeat. Protect Emily, sometimes underlined, sometimes circled. She flipped through more pages. September 29th. Emily called today, voice trembling. She didn't say it, but I heard it. The need, the ache. She's still pure of heart, still different. October 12th. Margaret asked again about the house. Said it would make a good bed and breakfast. I laughed. She didn't. November 6th. The lawyer came. We recorded it. She deserves protection. I fear they will descend when I'm gone. Emily closed the journal, her throat tight. Her grandmother hadn't just loved her, she'd planned for her, protected her in the face of hostility and silence. This room, this hidden sanctuary, was proof of just how far she'd gone to ensure that Emily would one day understand. She spent the rest of the day going through the boxes on the shelves. Some held photographs from decades past. Her grandmother as a young woman, standing in front of the same house. Others contained letters, many of them never sent. A few were addressed to Emily. She set those aside. In the back corner of the room, she found a small metal box locked with a combination dial. The numbers on the dial were worn smooth. She tried a few combinations, birthdays, anniversaries, but nothing worked. Frustrated, she stood and looked around the room again. Her eyes landed on a framed photo on the far wall. It was of her and her grandmother sitting on the porch swing, both smiling, taken when she was maybe 8. On the frame, scratched faintly into the wood, were 4 digits. She tried them. The lock clicked open. Inside were legal documents, sealed letters, and one narrow envelope with her name written in bold ink. She opened it slowly. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means I've gone and the storm I feared has come. You must understand, I didn't leave you the house out of sentiment. I left it to you because you are the only one who never demanded it. You gave me joy without asking for anything. That is a rare gift. Within this room are the truths I've collected. I trust you'll know what to do with them. Use what you find wisely. Protect yourself. And above all, don't trust what's been rehearsed. Listen only to what your heart confirms. With all my love, always, Grandma. Emily sat on the floor, surrounded by dusty boxes and yellowing paper, and cried. Not because she was afraid, but because she finally understood the weight of what she'd inherited. And it had nothing to do with money. The wind had picked up by the time Emily resurfaced from the hidden room. The sky outside was a low sheet of gray, thick with the scent of rain, and the old trees swayed with slow, ominous rhythm. Back upstairs, she locked the attic door behind her and slid the bookshelf back into place. The air in the house now felt different, thicker somehow, charged. The secrets she had uncovered below didn't just answer questions. They raised new ones. The truth, now in her hands, was a kind of armor, but it was also a target. The first warning came early the next morning. She stepped out onto the porch to fetch the mail and noticed something odd. Her car, parked just beside the house, looked slightly off, angled differently than she remembered. As she approached it, the damage became clear. Both rear tires had been slashed. Clean, deliberate cuts, not the work of sharp gravel or age. Someone had done this overnight. Someone had been close enough to the house to touch her car and leave silently. She stood frozen for a moment, then turned and scanned the woods surrounding the property. The trees were still. No movement, no sound, but the message had been delivered. She was not welcome. Back inside, she called the local police department to report the vandalism. The officer who arrived an hour later was a middle-aged man named Deputy Laird, with a thin mustache and weary eyes. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked, crouching beside the vehicle. "I have more than a few," Emily replied. He looked up at her. "You've got family around here, right?" "Some of them don't consider me family." Laird stood, brushing his hands off. "We had a few noise complaints from this street over the years, mostly domestic disputes. Your Aunt Margaret ever been a problem before?" Emily hesitated. "Not to the law, I think, but she's been vocal." He nodded slowly. "We'll file a report, but without witnesses or footage, not much we can do. Any security cameras?" Emily shook her head. "You might want to consider installing some," he said, "and I'd keep the doors locked, just in case." After he left, she ordered a set of motion sensor cameras and scheduled an installation for the following day. That night, she double-checked every lock and window, pulling the curtains closed even though she hated the way it made the house feel sealed in. Later, as she sat by the fireplace, trying to read one of the letters from her grandmother, her phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "You should have walked away." She stared at the message, her hands cold. It wasn't just intimidation now. It was a direct threat. She forwarded the message to Mr. Whitman, who called her moments later. Emily listened carefully. He said, "I've filed a preemptive motion with the probate court. Based on the audio Derek gave you and the threats you're receiving, we're building a case not just to protect the will, but to bring legal scrutiny against your aunt and the others if this continues." "You think they'll really try to undo everything legally?" "I think they already are. Margaret has retained a second attorney, Lyle Kenner. He's aggressive, high profile, known for dragging things out. They're going to try and bury you in paperwork and fear." "I found something else," she said, and told him briefly about the hidden room, the journal, the envelope. There was a pause. "Emily, that could be invaluable. Make copies of everything. Keep the originals in a safe place." "I will." The next day brought a new face to her doorstep. Derek returned, this time unannounced, with his shoulders hunched and eyes darting. He carried a paper bag and looked like he hadn't slept. "I brought something," he said. Emily let him in. He set the bag on the kitchen table and pulled out a stack of folded documents, handwritten notes, phone records, and what looked like old bank statements. "After I gave you the flash drive, I started going through some of my mother's old files," he said. "I found these hidden in a desk drawer at her office. It's not a smoking gun, but it shows she was trying to manipulate Grandma's finances months before her death." Emily leafed through them. One note caught her eye. Margaret handwriting, listing potential buyers for the land surrounding the property. It was dated before the will had even been updated. She was planning to sell everything. Emily said, voice low, "And keep the profits," Derek replied. "None of us knew. She talked about how the land was a burden, how she'd rather cash out before the taxes caught up. But this was months ago. Why are you really doing this?" Emily asked, setting the papers down. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I used to believe her," he said. "We all did. She talked about loyalty like it was currency. But after hearing what she said about Grandma, after seeing what she tried to do to you, I can't ignore it. And maybe it's selfish, but I don't want to be part of it anymore." Emily nodded. "You should be careful. They're getting bold." He glanced out the window. "I've already started getting the cold shoulder from Rachel and Stephen. I think they know I gave you something." As he left, Emily handed him a folder. "It's a copy of the journal entries I found. If anything happens to me, you make sure this gets to Mr. Whitman." Derek took it, his expression solemn. "Nothing's going to happen to you." But later that evening, as she sat in the living room updating the security settings on her new camera system, her phone rang again. This time it was Beth. "You think you're so clever," she said, her voice sharp and slurred. "You think because you found some dusty old books at your safe? That house isn't yours. You're not one of us. You never were. Are you drinking?" Emily asked, her tone flat. "Maybe, maybe not. But you know what's funny? No matter what that lawyer says or what Grandma recorded, we're going to fight. And when this is over, all you'll have is an empty house and a pile of bad memories." Emily ended the call without replying. She took a breath, steadied her hands, and saved the call recording. Every new encounter, every veiled threat, they were stacking like bricks, and she was determined to build a wall strong enough to withstand anything the family threw at her. That night, before bed, she placed a fresh journal on the nightstand and began writing her own entries, not just about what happened, but how it felt, the loneliness, the small triumphs, the echo of her grandmother's voice in the corners of the house. She wasn't just living in the legacy now. She was continuing it. She wrote one line, underlined twice. "They want me to be afraid, but I'm finally starting to feel like myself." And then, just before she turned off the lamp, she heard it. A single knock, not at the front door, at the back, the one that led to the woods. The knock at the back door came again, sharper this time, more deliberate. Emily stood frozen in the dark, the pen still in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one ever came to the back of the house. That door faced the woods, and beyond that, a long stretch of nothing. No driveway, no neighbors, just trees and the sound of wind threading through branches. She reached into the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out the small flashlight and the can of pepper spray she had bought 2 days earlier. Quietly, she crept out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and through the kitchen. The back door came into view, its frosted glass window catching the moonlight like a dull eye. She waited, holding her breath. A third knock, softer now, almost hesitant. Then a voice. "It's me." She exhaled sharply. "Derek." Emily opened the door, but kept the chain locked. Derek stood outside, hunched in a hoodie, eyes darting nervously over his shoulder. "I shouldn't be here," he said quickly, "but I just got off the phone with someone I think you need to talk to." Emily removed the chain and let him in. "What's going on?" "There's this woman," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "Her name's Lorraine. She used to live next door to Grandma, long before she moved into this house. I only remembered her because she came up during a conversation once. Grandma said Lorraine was one of the few people who ever told the truth, no matter how ugly it was." Emily leaned against the counter. "And she knows something?" "She knew Grandma for almost 40 years. Said she saw things, heard things about the family. She said if you wanted answers, she was the one to find." "Where is she?" "Outside town. Newberry Road. It's a bit of a drive. I can take you." Emily hesitated. "Does she know I'm coming?" "She said you'd come. I don't know how, but she sounded certain." Less than an hour later, they were driving through winding back roads, headlights cutting through dense fog. The woods thinned, giving way to open fields and decaying barns, until they reached a small cabin near a dried-out creek bed. The mailbox read, "El Cross." Lorraine opened the door before they knocked. She was in her 70s, thin and sharp-eyed, with gray hair braided tightly down her back. She wore a long cardigan and house slippers, and carried herself like someone who had long stopped fearing what others thought. "You're late," she said, motioning them inside. The living room was filled with books, plants, and the scent of cloves. She pointed to 2 mismatched chairs and sat in a rocker near the window. "I'm not here to dig up old gossip," Emily said carefully. "But if you knew my grandmother, and if you know what's happening." Lorraine waved a hand. "I knew Alice since we were both just out of school. She had the kind of heart people want to take from, not nurture. I watched her fight her whole life to keep pieces of herself intact, especially around family." Emily nodded slowly. She didn't talk much about the past. "Not to me." "She wouldn't," Lorraine said, "not to protect herself, but to protect you. She always believed there was a sickness in that family. Not the kind you cure with medicine, but a moral decay, jealousy, entitlement, small cruelties that added up. Margaret didn't start out vicious, but bitterness made her cruel. And the others, they just learned by watching." Emily leaned forward. "Did she ever talk about her decision to leave everything to me?" Lorraine smiled faintly. "Not directly, but she talked about you often. Said you had a different kind of stillness, that you saw what people tried to hide. She called you the only person in her life who never took without giving something back. She left a journal," Emily said, "pages of notes about everyone. And my name, over and over, Protect Emily." "I believe it," Lorraine said. She knew they'd come for you, that they'd resent you just for being chosen. But she also believed you were strong enough to handle it. Emily hesitated. "Is there more?" Lorraine stood and walked over to a small cabinet. Pulling out a worn envelope, she handed it to Emily. "She left this with me 2 years ago. Said I'd know when to give it to you." Inside was a letter, handwritten in her grandmother's careful script. "Emily, if you are reading this, it means the tide has turned. There will be moments ahead where truth feels heavier than silence. In those moments, remember this. Love is not a weakness. It is a weapon they can't use because they never learned how. There are things you'll still uncover, things hidden in plain sight. Trust your instincts. Not everything I left is visible at first glance. And if you ever wonder whether I doubted you, know this, I never did. Be brave and stay kind. That's how you win. All my love, Grandma." Emily folded the letter, her throat tight. Lorraine watched her quietly. "Your grandmother didn't believe in curses," she said, "but she did believe in cycles. And she believed you were the one who could break them." Derek drove her back in silence. The sky had cleared, and the moon cast pale light across the fields. Back at the house, Emily found herself standing in the parlor, staring at the fireplace. Something Lorraine had said about things hidden in plain sight kept ringing in her head. She lit a fire, more out of instinct than necessity, and watched the flames for several minutes. Then she noticed it. A thin line at the base of the mantel, too straight to be natural. She got down on her knees and felt along the edge. A panel slid back under pressure, revealing a narrow cubby behind the bricks. Inside was a small tin box. She pulled it out and opened the lid. Inside were several old photographs, a few receipts, and a cassette tape. The label read, October 3rd, 1996. She stared at the tape, heart pounding. That date meant nothing to her. She didn't own a cassette player, but she remembered seeing an old stereo system in the attic. 30 minutes later, the tape played with a low hiss. Her grandmother's voice filled the room, younger, more forceful. If anything happens to me, if this tape is ever found, I want the truth to be known. In October 1996, I discovered Margaret had tried to take a second mortgage out on the property, using forged documents. I confronted her. She denied it, but I kept the records. They're hidden, and if you're listening to this, it means she never changed. Emily sat back, stunned. Her grandmother had predicted everything, recorded everything, protected not just his estate, but the truth. She looked around the room, feeling the full weight of the house now, not just its history, but its legacy, and she realized she wasn't just searching for answers anymore. She was preparing for the final confrontation. Emily didn't sleep that night. The cassette played in her mind long after it stopped spinning, her grandmother's voice repeating in fragments like a coded warning. She never changed. The truth of that statement settled deep inside her, undeniable now. Margaret hadn't just hoped to control the estate. She had tried to steal it long before Emily was old enough to understand what inheritance even meant. The next morning brought little relief. Rain lashed against the windows, and a cold wind howled through the trees. Emily spent the early hours rechecking the locations of everything she had uncovered. The journal pages, the cassette tape, Lorraine's letter, Derek's documents, and moved them into a fireproof lockbox she purchased from the hardware store. She placed it in the attic, behind a loose panel in the wall, and made a mental note of every detail. If someone came looking, they wouldn't find it easily. As she descended the attic stairs, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A notification flashed across the screen. A parcel had arrived at the local post office, marked as a delivery hold. The sender listed only one name, Alice Davis. She stared at the screen, confusion giving way to something closer to disbelief. Her grandmother had been dead for weeks. Emily hadn't given out her current address to anyone but Mr. Whitman, and certainly not to the post office. She called the clerk, a woman named Marnie, who confirmed the package was real and had arrived just this morning. According to the tracking slip, it had been rerouted through 3 different distribution centers before finally reaching Maple Hollow. The original postmark was dated over a year ago. Emily was out the door and on the road within minutes. When she arrived, Marnie handed her a small, flat envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her grandmother's in bold, slanted strokes. Inside was a single folded letter and a black and white photograph of the house as it looked in the 1940s. Freshly painted, surrounded by open fields. Emily read the letter standing right there in the post office, her breath catching at the first sentence. Dearest Emily, if this reaches you, then something went wrong. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but I prepared for it all the same. Enclosed is a photograph of the house, taken the year your great-grandfather built the foundation with his own hands. What you need is in that photograph, though you may not see it at first. I've hidden something in the house, something Margaret and the others would never think to look for, because they never cared enough to learn the stories behind these walls. You will understand when the time is right. It belongs to you, and it may be the only way to finish what I started. I am proud of you, not because of what you'll find, but because you looked. That's what makes you different, with love that never ends. Grandma. Emily stared at the photo. At first, it seemed ordinary. The house looked cleaner, less aged. No trees surrounded it yet. The porch had fewer steps. But then she noticed something odd near the bottom right corner. A square patch of foundation that looked slightly darker than the rest, almost like it had been patched or modified after the rest was built. By the time she got back to the house, the rain had stopped but left everything soaked and glistening. She changed into work clothes, grabbed a small crowbar, gloves, and a flashlight, and went outside to the corner she had seen in the photo. The area near the foundation was covered in ivy and tangled brush. She began pulling it back, slowly revealing the concrete beneath. There, just as the photo suggested, was a faint seam in the wall, like a panel or door carved into the foundation. It wasn't obvious from any distance, but up close, the difference in texture was clear. The cement here had been poured separately and more recently than the rest of the house. She tapped along the surface, listening for the hollow ring that would confirm her suspicion. Found it. She worked for nearly half an hour before the panel gave way, swinging open with a low creak. Behind it was a dark void, a shallow space just large enough to crawl into. She reached inside and found a metal box tucked behind a wooden beam. It was heavy, locked, and coated in decades of dust. Inside the house, she set the box on the kitchen table and examined the lock. It wasn't like the others, a dial or a key, but instead a simple latch secured by a sliding pin. When she pried it open, the contents stopped her cold. Cash, dozens of envelopes stuffed with neatly folded bills. Beneath them, several small velvet pouches containing jewelry, pieces she recognized from childhood, thought long sold or lost. And under that, at the bottom of the box, were 4 leather-bound ledgers. She opened the first. Each ledger was a financial record, handwritten, balanced to the penny. Over 20 years of transactions. But these weren't ordinary household accounts. These were records of payments made to support Emily. Tuition, rent, groceries, even healthcare premiums. Her grandmother had paid for everything anonymously. The entries didn't list Emily by name, but used only the initials EGI, accompanied by codes and abbreviations. The second ledger showed something else entirely, withdrawals, large ones, transferred quietly from an account belonging to Margaret. Each one matched dates when Emily remembered her family accusing her grandmother of being forgetful or confused. She sat down, her head spinning. Her grandmother hadn't just hidden her support. She had done it while manipulating the narrative, letting others think she was failing while she built a quiet, strategic firewall around Emily's future. The house, the journals, the legal recordings. And now this, and still, she hadn't told her, not directly, because if she had, Emily might have felt obligated, guilty, pressured to repay something that was never meant to be a loan. She turned the final page of the last ledger and found a note tucked into the back sleeve. The truth always costs more than lies, but it pays back in peace. That night, Emily locked everything in the attic safe and backed up photographs of every document. She drafted a new timeline for Mr. Whitman and wrote a second affidavit, this one detailing what she discovered. Her hand didn't tremble this time. She felt steady, certain. For the first time since arriving in Maple Hollow, she wasn't reacting. She was preparing. At dawn, she walked out to the porch, coffee in hand, and watched the sky turn from gray to pink. Behind her, the house stood quiet but firm, no longer just a building, but a vault of legacy and resistance. And now she had the key. By the end of the week, the quiet surrounding the estate felt unnatural. Emily moved through the house with the vigilance of someone expecting impact. Each creak of the floor, every flicker of light through the windows, seemed charged with unseen consequence. Since finding the hidden ledgers and discovering the vast extent of her grandmother's protection, Emily had been methodically cataloging every new piece of information. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important remained just beyond reach. Unseen, unspoken. The cassette, the journal, the letter from Lorraine, the old photograph, the financial records. All of it painted a portrait of quiet defiance. But they also revealed a careful strategy, not just to ensure Emily inherited the property, but to shield her from something far more threatening than family bitterness. The legacy was deeper than legal ownership or land value. It was about truth and what that truth could destroy. The next clue arrived in the form of a hollowed-out book. Emily discovered it while rearranging the upstairs library, a task she had taken on in an effort to both restore and understand her grandmother's habits. Tucked behind a row of vintage novels was a worn copy of The Turn of the Screw, one of her grandmother's favorites. It was heavier than the others. When Emily pulled it free, she heard something slide inside. She flipped it open and found the center of the pages carved out cleanly, forming a secret compartment. Inside was a small velvet pouch and a folded envelope. The pouch contained a key. The envelope bore her grandmother's handwriting again. For the safety deposit box, Bank of Maple Hollow. Branch manager, Louise Yarrow. Show this letter, if needed. Tell her it's time for the last ledger. She'll understand. Emily stared at the note, heart thudding. The last ledger. The next morning, she drove into town. The bank was a modest brick building on the main road, a place Emily hadn't entered since childhood. The name Yarrow was familiar, and when she approached the front desk and asked to see Louise, the receptionist smiled and nodded. She's in. Let me let her know. Minutes later, a tall, dark-haired woman in her early 60s emerged, glasses perched low on her nose. She looked at Emily for a moment, then broke into a small, knowing smile. "You're Alice's granddaughter," she said. "You have her eyes." "I was told to come see you," Emily said, holding out the envelope. "She said you'd understand." Louise read the note silently, her face hardening. Then she nodded once and gestured toward the private offices and back. 10 minutes later, Emily sat across from her as a box was placed gently on the desk. Louise unlocked it with a key identical to the one Emily had found. "This has been here for almost 15 years, she said. "Your grandmother made special arrangements for it. She said one day someone might come looking, not just for property or inheritance, but for truth." Emily opened the box and stared. Inside was a thick file of legal documents, but what stood out immediately was a birth certificate. She picked it up, her hand suddenly cold. It bore her name, Emily Jean Davis. Date of birth matched. Hospital and county were accurate, but the section for father was blank. She frowned, flipping through more papers. A second envelope marked private adoption inquiry. Inside was a letter from a legal office dated 2 decades ago, requesting confirmation of biological parentage. Attached was a notarized statement. Emily's breath caught. The statement had been signed by her grandmother and read, in part, "Emily is the child of Margaret Davis. The father is unknown. The child has been raised believing another arrangement. Under no circumstances should her lineage be disclosed unless absolutely necessary for her protection." The air left Emily's lungs. She was Margaret's daughter. Her mind reeled. She had been told since childhood that she was the daughter of Alice's youngest son, who died in a car accident when Emily was 3. That had always been the story. A simple, tragic narrative. But this changed everything. Her grandmother hadn't just chosen her over the others. She had been shielding her from the truth of her own birth, from a history rewritten to protect her from the person who should have loved her most and didn't. She turned to Louise. "Did you know?" "I suspected," Louise said gently. "Alice confided in me sometimes, but never the full details. Just that Margaret wasn't capable of being the mother Emily needed." Emily pressed her fingers to her forehead. "Why wouldn't she tell me?" "Maybe because it wasn't safe," Louise replied. "Or maybe because she believed one day you'd be strong enough to discover it yourself and decide what to do with it." Emily took the file and returned to the house in a daze. She locked herself in the study and reread every page. There were court letters, legal guardianship documents transferring custody from Margaret to Alice when Emily was less than a year old. Quiet, sealed proceedings. There were no dramatic legal battles, no scandal, just a slow, silent erasure of a mother who had walked away or been pushed. A page near the back confirmed what Emily suspected. Margaret had attempted to reclaim custody years later, but had been denied. The file included a brief psychological evaluation, not recommended for maternal custody due to unstable behavior, narcissistic patterns, and verbal aggression. Emily sat in silence for over an hour. When the knock came at the door, she didn't answer. She waited, holding her breath. "Emily, it's Derek," came the voice through the door. "Please, I need to talk to you." She opened it cautiously, her expression unreadable. Derek stepped inside, eyes wide with anxiety. "Something's happened." Beth got served. A formal notice. The courts agreed to hear Margaret's petition to contest the will. Emily stared. On what grounds? Claiming undue influence, mental instability. They're saying Grandma was paranoid, that you manipulated her. Of course they are. They don't know what you found, do they? He asked. She handed him a copy of the adoption file. He read it in stunned silence. So that's why she hated you so much. She hated what I reminded her of. Emily reached into the drawer and retrieved a letter from her grandmother. She knew this would happen, she said. All of it. Derek looked at her carefully. Then you have everything you need now. Emily met his eyes. Not everything. Not yet, but I'm close. Because beneath the truth about her parentage and the lies that framed her childhood, there was still one final piece left to uncover. Why her grandmother had believed it wasn't just protection Emily needed, but defense. 2 days after Emily uncovered the truth about her lineage, she stood before the full-length mirror in her grandmother's room, adjusting the collar of a navy blue coat. Her reflection looked unfamiliar, sharper, older, not just from sleepless nights or the weight of revelations, but from a shift inside her that had become irreversible. She no longer saw herself as the girl who had returned to Maple Hollow for a funeral. She was something else now, heir, witness, and keeper of secrets that could shatter the facade her family had spent decades constructing. The summons arrived that morning, official stamped and delivered by courier. Margaret's legal team had filed a petition contesting the will on 3 fronts: mental incompetence, undue influence, and procedural fraud. The court date was set for 2 weeks later. Enough time to prepare, but not so much that the pressure wouldn't tighten its grip. Mr. Whitman met her that afternoon at the house, his brow furrowed and a briefcase heavier than usual. "I've reviewed the petition," he said, spreading the documents out across the dining room table. "It's as aggressive as expected." Their lead attorney, Lyle Kenner, included affidavits from Rachel and Beth claiming your grandmother was exhibiting signs of memory loss and paranoia. "None of it's true," Emily replied. "I know that, but the court doesn't know that yet. And hearsay from family members, unfortunately, can carry weight, especially in small towns where reputations do half the work." Emily pulled out the transcript she had made of the cassette tape. "We have this, plus the video you recorded with her weeks before she passed." Whitman nodded. "Those are critical pieces of evidence, and they'll be central to your defense. But they're not the only thing we'll need. If this case goes to trial, Kenner will try to bury us in doubt. We need witnesses, people who saw her in her final weeks and can attest to her clarity." "I've already contacted Lorraine," Emily said. "She's willing to testify. And there's Derek. I'll prepare both statements. But there's something else we need to talk about." He pulled a sealed manila envelope from his briefcase. "I've been working in this town a long time," he said. "I've handled over a dozen contested wills, but none of them came close to the kind of sabotage I'm seeing here. I made some calls. Margaret's lawyer, Kenner, has a history of using invasive tactics to sway opinion before trial. And there's a rumor he's requested an ex parte order to temporarily freeze the estate until matters resolved." Emily's stomach dropped. "Can he do that?" "He can try. But unless he presents convincing evidence that something illegal occurred, like coercion or forgery, it's unlikely the judge will grant it. Still, you need to be prepared. If the order is granted, it means you can't access funds from this estate. No renovations, no sale, nothing, and more importantly, it gives them leverage to drag this out and wear you down financially." Emily paced the room, the soft creak of the floorboards under her boots echoing her growing frustration. "So, what do we do?" Whitman's gaze didn't waver. "We fight back. With precision. I need you to prepare a detailed timeline. Every encounter you've had with Margaret or the others since the funeral. Every threat, every unannounced visit, every irregularity." "I've been keeping notes," she said, "and I recorded the call from Beth." "Good. Also, I want to bring in an independent forensic analyst, Someone who can verify the authenticity of the video, the handwriting in the journal, and even the cassette. It'll help shut down any claim that these were fabricated. Emily nodded. I'll cooperate with whatever you need. That night, she stayed up organizing files. Every page was photographed, indexed, and uploaded to an encrypted drive. She made multiple backups. She wasn't just building a defense. She was creating a wall of truth high enough to crush any lie Margaret dared to throw at her. 3 days later, a letter arrived via certified mail, this time from the judge presiding over the case. As Whitman predicted, Kenner had filed for a temporary injunction. The court had scheduled an emergency hearing to review the request. Emily attended the hearing with Mr. Whitman by her side. The courtroom was small, its oak benches polished to a dull sheen. Margaret sat with her attorney near the front, dressed in a tailored gray suit, her expression unreadable. Beth and Rachel flanked her, both avoiding eye contact. The judge, an older man with a reputation for strict interpretations of the law, entered without ceremony. Kenner stood and launched into his argument. Your Honor, we have substantial concern that Miss Davis exerted undue influence over the deceased in the final months of her life. The sudden and total exclusion of all other family members from the will raises significant red flags. Emily watched unmoving as he laid out their accusations. False claims about her grandmother's mental health, suggestions that Emily had manipulated her during a period of cognitive decline. The only thing missing was a single shred of truth. When Whitman responded, his tone was calm but piercing. We have a notarized video recording of the decedent, dated just weeks before her death, in which she clearly articulates her intentions. We have journals in her own handwriting, witnesses prepared to testify to her clarity, and extensive documentation that shows consistent and deliberate planning over several years. Kenner scoffed. Easily manufactured. Whitman's eyes narrowed, which is why we've already retained a third-party forensic expert to verify their authenticity. We will also present evidence showing the petitioner, Margaret Davis, engaged in prior attempt to access and manipulate the estate, long before the will was amended. The judge raised his hand, signaling both attorneys to stop. I've reviewed the preliminary documents, he said, adjusting his glasses. And while the claims are serious, I see no immediate evidence to justify freezing the estate. The emergency motion is denied. We will proceed with the full hearing as scheduled. Emily exhaled slowly, but didn't relax. Not yet. Outside the courthouse, Margaret brushed past her without a word, but Rachel lingered behind, watching Emily with something between curiosity and contempt. You think you won something, she said quietly, but it's not over. Emily didn't reply. She simply turned away and walked toward Whitman's car. As they drove back, her attorney glanced at her. Your grandmother knew what she was doing when she left it all to you, he said, but she also knew they'd do everything to take it back. Emily nodded. She prepared me. They arrived at the house just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the porch. Inside, the air was still. Emily walked through the hall, her hand grazing the wall as if checking its strength. She had come to Maple Hollow to say goodbye. Instead, she became the last line of defense in a battle her grandmother had started long before her death. But now, with each threat met, each secret uncovered, Emily was no longer just defending the past. She was rewriting what came next. The morning after the emergency hearing, Emily awoke to find a small envelope slid under the front door. There was no stamp, no name on the outside, just her name handwritten in shaky letters. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a single flash drive and a brief note. I can't be part of their lie anymore. You deserve to know everything. D. Emily stared at the letter, her mind spinning. She already had the previous recordings Derek had shared, but this felt different, more urgent. She plugged the flash drive into her laptop and opened the folder. It contained a single audio file, time-stamped from the previous week. Just 2 days before the emergency hearing. She clicked play. The recording was faint at first, the voices distant, but she recognized them immediately, Margaret and Kenner. She's more stubborn than I expected, Margaret said. I thought she'd fold after the first filing. It doesn't matter, Kenner replied. We'll discredit her. Keep her busy. Pile on the paperwork. Grind her down. I've seen it work before. There was a pause, followed by a sound like a wine glass being set down. And what if it doesn't work? Margaret asked. Then we hit her where it hurts. The narrative. Make her unstable in the public eye. I have someone lined up to testify. She was seen yelling in town. Add a little drama, a few emotional outbursts, and we paint her as volatile. Emily paused the playback, bile rising in her throat. They weren't just challenging the will. They were orchestrating a full assault on her character. Every conversation, every move, had been part of a calculated plan to manipulate perception and weaponize doubt. She resumed the file. And the documents? Margaret asked. The ones she found? Don't worry. I've got someone checking if any of it can be dismissed as inadmissible or unverifiable. Worst case, we question the chain of custody. Suggest fabrication. The court won't throw it out, but it'll seed enough suspicion to complicate everything. The file ended with a faint sound of laughter. Margaret's. Emily sat in silence, fingers curled tightly around the edge of her desk. This wasn't just legal maneuvering anymore. It was character assassination. And yet, Derek had recorded it. He had chosen her. She called him immediately. He answered on the first ring, his voice low. I didn't know what to do, he said before she could speak. I didn't mean to be in the room. They thought I'd gone to bed. But when I heard what they were planning, I couldn't let it go. I'm glad you didn't, she said. But are you safe? I've already packed a bag, he said. Rachel's not speaking to me. Stephen tried to corner me yesterday and told me to stop playing both sides. But I'm done pretending. I'll testify. I'll sign whatever you need. I'm not going to let them rewrite the truth. She met with Whitman later that day and handed him the flash drive. This changes everything, he said after listening to the file. Kenner isn't just pushing legal boundaries. He's violating ethical ones. We can use this, not only to discredit his entire strategy, but to bring potential misconduct charges. Emily exhaled slowly. Derek's willing to testify. Good. I'll draft the affidavit. The following day, Emily returned to the hidden study beneath the attic. She hadn't been down there in nearly a week. Dust had settled again, but the air remained dry and preserved. She opened the journal and turned to the later pages. Her grandmother's handwriting had grown shakier near the end, but the clarity never faded. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before her death, caught her eye. Derek is watching them. I believe he may become the one ally Emily never expected. I hope I'm right. If he steps forward, she'll know she's not alone. Emily ran her finger over the words. Her grandmother had seen it coming, had predicted Derek's choice long before he made it. It wasn't just intuition, it was understanding. She had known her family too well. Later that evening, Emily sat with Derek in the kitchen. The wind was rising outside, scattering leaves across the porch. The house groaned with its usual late autumn rhythm. I found out, Emily said quietly, about my birth. He looked down. I wondered when that would come up. You knew? I suspected. The way Margaret talked about you, there was always something extra in it, not just resentment, guilt, fear, like you were a mirror she couldn't avoid. She abandoned me, Emily said, and Grandma rewrote the story to protect me. You turned out better than any of us, he said. Because of her. Emily pulled a fresh document from her bag and slid it across the table. It was a written declaration, listing the content of the ledgers, the adoption records, and her current legal standing as a sole heir. Below that, 2 witness lines. I need you to sign as my corroborating witness, she said. It's not just for court. It's for the record. I want there to be no doubt where you stood. Derek picked up the pen and signed without hesitation. A few hours later, Whitman called. His voice carried a note of triumph. The court accepted the recordings, and the judge approved our motion to introduce character evidence. Kenner's reputation is damaged. He might still try to salvage the case, but without the credibility of his claims, they've lost momentum. What does that mean? It means they're running out of tools to fight you. We're winning. Emily didn't smile. Not yet. The final hearing was still ahead. But for the first time, the scales had tipped. She stood on the porch that night, the flash drive in her pocket and the truth heavy in her bones. The wind had cleared the sky, and the stars shone hard and cold above the trees. For weeks, she had lived beneath the weight of shadows and silence. Now, a new clarity had begun to take shape, not just in the law, but in the hearts of those who once stayed silent and now stood beside her. The morning of the final, hearing arrived draped in a heavy fog. The town of Maple Hollow seemed to hold its breath. The streets empty, the trees still. Emily stood in the doorway of the house, dressed in black slacks, a tailored coat, and a scarf her grandmother had knitted years ago, a quiet reminder of who she was walking in to defend. She closed the door behind her and locked it with deliberate calm. Today would be the last time Margaret and her allies would try to take away what was never meant for them. Mr. Whitman picked her up at 8 o'clock sharp. His expression was unreadable, his suit more formal than usual, and the briefcase in his hand held everything they had assembled over the past weeks. Transcripts, recordings, forensic reports, affidavits, and legal correspondence. He had labeled and cross-referenced every page. "You ready?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Let's finish this." At the courthouse, they were escorted to a larger courtroom than the one used during the emergency hearing. Inside, Margaret sat flanked by Rachel, Beth, and Stephen. Kenner, her attorney, stood stiffly at the plaintiff's table, no longer as smug as he had been. Derek arrived separately, taking a seat near the front row of the gallery. Emily met his eyes, gave a nod, then turned her focus forward. The judge entered promptly, gavel striking once. This court is now in session to hear arguments regarding the contestation of the last will and testament of Alice Davis. Kenner rose first. His voice was practiced, but lacked its previous fire. He recited the same accusations: mental decline, undue influence, questionable isolation, but the weight behind his words had faded. He knew what evidence was coming. This was posturing now, a final effort to sway a tired court with repetition and ambiguity. Whitman responded with precision. He presented the notarized video recording of Alice Davis, the forensic analysis verifying her mental capacity, and the documentation of her consistent estate planning over several years. He submitted Emily's journals, Derek's signed statement, and Lorraine Cross's affidavit confirming Alice's clarity and intention. Each document was admitted into evidence without objection. Then came the recordings. Whitman played the flash drive Derek had submitted. The conversation between Margaret and Kenner discussing their plan to discredit Emily. The room shifted palpably as their voices filled the space, casual and cruel, laying bare their intent not to seek justice, but to break Emily through manipulation and public doubt. Margaret's face turned to stone. Rachel and Beth avoided eye contact. The judge listened without interruption, then turned to Kenner. "Mr. Kenner, are you prepared to explain this recording?" Kenner stood slowly. "Your Honor, we dispute the context." The judge raised a hand. "This court doesn't try context. It tries facts. And the fact is, this recording demonstrates a willful attempt to manipulate the court's perception and undermine a lawful will." Kenner sat back down without another word. Next, Whitman called Derek to stand. Derek answered questions clearly, recounting behavior he had witnessed in the weeks following Alice Davis's death. He described the coordinated efforts to exclude Emily, the conversations overheard, and his decision to step forward after recognizing how far Margaret and the others were willing to go. "I saw who they really were," he said, "and I saw who Emily is. My grandmother trusted her for a reason. I couldn't live with myself if I let them destroy that." After Derek stepped down, Whitman called Emily. She approached the stand, took the oath, and sat facing the judge. Her voice was calm as she spoke. "I didn't come here to fight for a house or land," she said. "I came to say goodbye to my grandmother. I had no idea she'd left me anything. But when I learned the truth about the will, about the choices she made, I realized she wasn't just leaving me property. She was leaving me a legacy she had protected for decades." Whitman approached. "Did you ever ask the estate?" "No," Emily said. "I was told I had been forgotten, that there was nothing for me. I believed it. And what did you find instead?" "I found journals, letters, evidence of financial support I never knew about. and a history of choices my grandmother made to keep me safe, not just from poverty, but from the people who resented my existence. Do you believe your grandmother was of sound mind when she made her will?" "I do," Emily replied, "because everything she did, every word she left behind, was intentional. She knew they'd come for me, and she made sure I'd be ready." When Whitman ended the questions, the judge asked none. Emily returned to her seat. There was no rebuttal. Kenner stood once more and asked the court to consider the trauma of a grieving family and not to let one-sided recordings destroy the complex emotional dynamics of inheritance. The judge stared at him for a long moment before responding. "This court recognizes grief," he said, "but it does not recognize entitlement. What I've heard today is a clear record of intention by the decedent, supported by legal documentation, multiple witnesses, and direct evidence of obstruction by the petitioners." He turned to Margaret and the others. "It is the ruling of this court that the will of Alice Davis, as presented, is valid and enforceable. The estate remains in the sole possession of Emily Davis. Furthermore, I am recommending a formal inquiry into the actions of Mr. Kenner and the Davis family regarding their conduct during these proceedings." The gavel came down. Margaret stood, her face pale and unmoving. Rachel whispered something to her mother, but Margaret said nothing. Beth walked out first, her heels clicking against the tile floor like distant gunshots. Stephen followed, expression blank. Only Derek remained, nodding once before rising and walking to Emily's side. "You did it," he said. "No," she replied softly. "We did." Outside the courthouse, Emily felt the weight lift for the first time in weeks. Not completely. There was still healing to come, but the worst had passed. She had defended not just herself, but her grandmother's truth, and it had held. That night, she returned to the house and sat in the study beneath the attic, the old lamp casting warm light on the journal's final page. She picked up her pen and wrote, "The storm passed. The house stands. And in its walls, I've found the shape of who I really am. This isn't the end. It's the beginning." In the days following the final hearing, Maple Hollow resumed its usual rhythm. As if the courtroom clash that had nearly torn the Davis family apart had been little more than a ripple in the town's quiet waters. But for Emily, everything had changed. The estate was now officially hers. The legal battles were over, the petitions denied, and the smear campaigns dismantled by truth laid bare. Yet what remained was not a triumph soaked in victory. It was silence, not the hollow kind born of isolation, but the stillness that follows a storm. She spent the first evening after the ruling walking through every room of the house. Slowly, deliberately, the air smelled of wood and old dust, and the floor creaked under each step like a companion recounting stories. In the living room, she sat on the worn couch where her grandmother used to read, letting her fingers glide over the armrest as if to catch a trace of warmth. The house felt older, yes, but also deeper, like something that opened itself fully only once it was hers to truly see. That night, she lit a fire in the hearth and pulled the final journal from the hidden study. She hadn't touched it since the court date. Her grandmother's entries ended just a few days before her passing. There were no grand farewells or teary confessions, only reflections, brief but piercing thoughts shaped like warnings and prayers. If Emily is reading this, it means the house is finally hers. If she is not, then let this be my apology. I should have told her sooner. But I fear what the truth might do, not to her, but to those who still live in lies. Emily turned the page. We are the sum of our choices, and my choice was to protect her at any cost, even if it meant she might never understand why I had to lie. Another entry, dated just before her grandmother's death, was shorter. She has the strength. I've seen it. I only pray she never has to use it against those she once loved. Emily closed the journal and sat in the flickering light of the fire, the flames casting long shadows against the walls. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, no longer howling but whispering, like breath against an old wound beginning to heal. Over the next week, she began the slow work of restoring the house, not out of necessity, but from a desire to reclaim it. She cleaned the attic, removed the broken floorboards in the east bedroom, and repainted the kitchen cabinets in the same sage green her grandmother had once described in letters. It was not an attempt to preserve the past, but to honor it while reshaping it in her own image. Derek came by twice, once with coffee and the second time with a toolbox and an offer to help fix the garden shed. They didn't talk about the court case anymore. They didn't need to. What had been said in court and in silence afterward had rewritten the boundaries between them. They weren't family in the traditional sense, but they had become something stronger, survivors of the same story, each with scars that knew the other's shape. On the third visit, Derek brought a small box. "Found this at my place," he said. "It's yours." Inside was a keychain Emily had lost in high school, an old brass owl her grandmother had given her, once attached to the house key. She turned it over in her hand, feeling the familiar weight. "She kept everything," Emily said. "Because you mattered," Derek replied, "even when you thought you didn't." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Derek added, "You ever gonna leave this place?" Emily looked out the window at the woods. "Maybe, but not yet. I think there's still something this house needs me to do." It wasn't long after that she began receiving letters, not from family. Those had gone quiet, but from townspeople. A neighbor who remembered Alice Davis, helping them with groceries during a hard winter. A librarian who recalled the afternoons Emily spent reading quietly in the corner while her grandmother ran errands. Each note was small, but each built something greater. A mosaic of a woman whose kindness had been silent but lasting. And one afternoon, tucked among those letters, came a message without a name. "You turned the house into a home again." She'd be proud. There was no signature, no return address. Emily smiled, folded the letter, and slid it between the final pages of the journal. Spring came late that year. The snow melted slowly, revealing green buds along the edge of the yard and fresh moss crawling across the stone path. Emily spent long mornings on the porch, sipping tea and watching birds return. She began writing, not just reflections, but the story of everything that had happened. Not for the courts, not even for family, but for the house. For the woman who had once written "Protect Emily" in a dozen pages of hidden ink. And on the last page of the journal, she added her own words. "In a world full of takers, she left everything to the one who never asked. And I carry that legacy not in fear, but in fire." This house was her story. Now it's mine, and I will fill it with truth. One evening, as the sun sank into trees and the world turned gold, she walked out onto the porch with the journal in her hands. The wind lifted gently through her hair. She stood at the edge of the steps, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth, the same way she had as a child. But this time, she wasn't looking for an exit. She was home, and the house, at last, was quiet. Not because it had secrets left to keep, but because the story had finally been told, and it would echo in its own way for as long as she stayed.